Chapter 5. After Marcos had been dispelled back into the desert, the expedition remained in Cibola. The men hobbled. They were bitter and exhausted. And for 2 long and hard days, they rested in the pueblo. They found corn and other grains, white flour and dry beans, all of which they took and consumed. During those days, the hot sun lingered with a humid and stifling air. The sun disappeared amongst the denser clouds and resembled an old man who was about to die. Coronado sat next to a dying flame and held his bandaged head in his hands. Having healed from his wounds, Coronado finally stood on his own doing. He walked along the pueblo in a staggered, trance-like state. He walked back and forth through each fire. The bloodstains on his bandage turned dark purple, and his protruding jaw struck like a mighty shadow. A man approached in the darkness. Coronado nodded. Castaneda spoke in pauses, stammers, and stutters, but Coronado remained calm and answered him. "Sir?" "Yes, Castaneda." Has the Viceroy?" "No," said Coronado. "No, he hasn't." What's the what?" "Your next command, sir." "I don't know yet," said Coronado. I don't. Give me another night. I need more time." The next night came, and about 30 men, including all the captains, arrived at Coronado's fire. They stood befuddled and waited for their orders. Coronado looked at them all, but he failed to say a word. Then he closed his eyes. The women rushed in, proceeded to his wound, and wrapped fresh bandages along his forehead. Coronado looked at his men, and then pointed his finger. He was still in a daze. He dipped his head and tried his best not to fall down. Cardenas approached and took over. The men remained confused. "The governor requires more rest. You will get your orders tomorrow morning." In the morning, Coronado slumped and dragged his feet slowly across the captain's tent. Finally, Coronado gave the captains their specific orders. He took his time and dictated each word, with long breaths in between. His voice was all but gone. When he finished, each captain saluted and departed the tent. Tovar and Sardina were the last captains to receive their orders. They waited for Coronado to address them. However, it seemed he did not know they were present. Coronado looked off east and seemingly ignored them. With his back still turned, Coronado breathed through his mouth, shook his head, and winced in pain. His hands appeared frail and crumbled. His face looked white and flushed, and as he bled from his nose, Coronado watched the drops of blood fall to the sand. "Governor," said Tovar. "Tovar," said Coronado. "Yes, sir." "Sardina." "Sir?" said Sardina. Coronado wiped his face with his hands and closed his eyes. "Go west, Tovar. Sardina, go north. Take your best men with you. Report back in 2 weeks." The captains confirmed. They nodded and saluted. Coronado rose his hand to salute back, but he lifted his hand only halfway. Then he looked back and stared again. "Tovar, Sardina." "Yes, sir." "Just find something. Anything." I took 10 of my men and a half a dozen guides, and we headed north as ordered. I took Julio, the Diaz brothers, and a few men from Castaneda's troop. Our horses languished, and soon the heat of the noonday sun became unbearable. The land was empty, much like the desert we had passed. Yet this land remained very flat, and it went on seemingly forever in an endless stretch of orange sand. I thought long and hard about the land. It was void of all living things. I thought that God, somehow in his infinite wisdom, had forgotten that he made such a place, and that we had sold our souls for permission to search this land in its entirety. It was a disconcerting thought, and it resurfaced over and over again in my mind. For the entire first day, we found nothing but sand and sky. For the second day, it seemed we found even less. The nearest tribe was a 3 days' walk away. During the third day, our search continued, but as midday approached, there was neither a sign of water or any report of life whatsoever. And as we followed the sun, we lost all sense of direction. And it was impossible to account how much ground we had lost or gained. As I stared at my men, I tried to assure them with nods and gestures of good faith, but they could tell I felt pity for them. I felt most pity for the younger men, for they never saw what I did. And every time I stared at Julio, I was reminded of Bernardo, only because of how youthful they both had looked. In my reveries, I thought of Bernardo many times, that sad, pathetic young boy whom I only knew for half a year. I thought about that arrow lodged in his eye, and that haunting, terrible sound of his wife sobbing. It had only been 2 weeks since he passed, but it felt like a decade. And what made it even sadder was that no one had talked about him. No one shared any memories. No one even brought him up in conversation. But, in a way, I knew why the men did not talk of him. Men can only endure so much pain and starvation. And the more I thought about it, the more I knew why the men had remained silent. The next morning, I ordered half of the men to go further north. A few hours later, they returned. They found neither food nor water. Then at noon, I ordered them to go west and search the trails. Each man seemed lost in his own meditation. They walked with fear, doubt, shame, and guilt. Their shoulders were hunched over. Their hands were stiff, and their knees trembled. They looked on into the distance as I did. The dream still with us. We still wanted to believe, and so we prayed. We prayed on and on. Some prayed to keep their sanity. Some prayed that Marcos had died in the desert. Others prayed for their children and negotiated with God. And again, we wondered. We dreamed and stared to the cities just beyond, because deeply embedded within us was that all-powerful promise, the promise of more. But in truth, at the moment, we were just looking for a sign. Be it a spirit, devil, or angel, it did not matter. We were looking for any sign. All that mattered was that we'd find something in this hell. And each day, we died a little more. At night, we made a fire. It whipped around a strong wind. I stared beyond and staggered until sundown. My eyes felt heavy. The chill of the air almost made me think it would snow. Although it was deathly quiet, a horrendous hum hovered about and stayed through my mind. And I slipped and drifted in and out of reverie. Then I fell into slumber, and I dipped into dream. In the dream, I saw nothing. Rather, I heard voices. I heard screams and shouts and cries, voices I remembered, voices I never heard. Certain sounds of my youth had returned, sounds of Spain and Portugal, sounds of the jungle, of Cusco and Catamarca. Then I heard the sounds of feet tumbling in haste, rushing through the sands and hills. Then I heard more voices. You'll make a fine soldier. What do you expect to find? This jungle never ends, does it? Would you rather die in a desert? The savage is near. Search every tree. You're not disciplined, Sardina. Buenos noches, senor. Toca la campana. Mi recuerda a Maio. Ding dong dong, ding dong. I awoke and felt the blood rush back to my forehead. I heard the men talk to each other. I couldn't tell what they were saying. All their voices merged into one horrendous, incoherent mumble. This land is horrible. It's goddamn horrible. What are we even here for? Why did Coronado send us this far? The voices dissipated. I stared back at the flame, and for the rest of the night, I stayed awake and waited for the sun. Another morning came. I ordered the men to leave me alone, and I tried to clear my mind. I looked out for about 5 minutes, then for another 10. And then it changed. And there we found him. It was a native. He was tall and lean. He stood erect, and he darted his eyes towards our direction. The men pointed and gawked. We got a closer look. The men shouted at him, but the native remained standing. The native's headdress reminded the men of the Grand Turks who stole the Holy Land. We surrounded the native and gathered the guides. The native did not blink. He raised his hands and gestured and gave us all a wry, stilted smile. For a long minute, the guides conversed back and forth, repeating and affirming. Then finally, one of the priests had understood and nodded. "He has a gift for us," said the priest. "Where is it?" I said. "He says he'll show us." The priest pointed over to a set of stones down a slight hill. The native walked over, and we followed. I took the lead and ordered my men to stay a safe distance behind. I reminded them to keep their vigilance, but they had already lost their minds. We came across a long, narrow strip of rock that for a minute seemed like it would lead to a stream. I looked all over, but I found no water. The native bent down and cupped his hands to the ground. He reached further into the earth and extended his arms and hand, and for the longest time, I remained unsure of what that gesture had meant. I stared at him, and he did the same. Finally, I understood. He wanted me to extend my hand too, so I stretched out my arms and opened my hands. "It's a trick!" shouted one of the men. "Captain, don't trust the savage!" But before I could turn my head, the native got back up to his feet. Then he dropped an ounce of gold in my open hand. I knew it was real when I felt it, and the native stared straight into my eyes. The men hushed and clutched at each other, and when I placed the gold in a patch and handed it over to them, they screamed out in joy. "Jesus, God Almighty! It can't be! It can't! Praise God! It's true! It is! God damn it is!" Only 2 questions remained: if there was more, and where it could be found. And the native nodded his head and confirmed. The guides had asked. The native pointed east, and we followed him further down the stones and patches of cacti. For another mile, we passed through a thicket of shrubs and webs. In the middle of the path, the native pointed to a small straw basket. Inside were rubies, pearls, silver, and gold. They were gems, solid and true. It was a small fortune, enough to buy a ship, and it was finally ours. I stood speechless. I was absolutely befuddled. All I could do was shake my head and listen to the men shout and holler. But soon, the silence came to them as well. No one believed what they had seen. We were baffled and scared and overwhelmed. And the native looked on at us with absolute disdain. For the next 3 days, we marched back to camp, and we studied the native every second we could. We called the native the Turk, simply because he looked like one. But with him, we indeed brought back something: a renewed faith. The Turk talked in a strange Babylon procession, and he would only talk in the evenings while we rested. He was animated and talked with his fingertips, as if a child making out the constellation of stars in his own wonderful majesty. When the translators asked what land the Turk belonged to, they responded cryptically. "The earth is the Turk's homeland. He roams as he pleases." I couldn't imagine a native so tall and deranged, but that was the Turk in his essence. Looking into his eyes was a kind of maniacal addiction. There was a certain pull his eyes had possessed. They were wicked and strange and all too alluring. They shifted like the tides of the ocean, They were dark and evil. They were exciting and irresistible. He was a natural wonder to behold, and he was ours, and ours alone. The next day, I saw an approaching storm. The sky turned purple and dark, and looming clouds spiraled and tumbled and whisked in fanciful billows of waves. The camp was another 2 days away. It felt as if we were the Magi's, crawling forth to Bethlehem. The men back in camp were living through a stagnant hell, but now we had a gift for them. It wasn't a panacea. Instead, it was a reason. It was a delirious reason to keep the dream alive. And we knew it was all that they needed. In the days that followed, Coronado's health improved. The gash on his head had healed. The medics cleared for him to conduct his daily activities, and for the remaining days, Coronado paced through the pueblo and made his rounds around the camp with his head painfully held up high. At noon of each day, Castaneda met Coronado and read thoroughly from his quilled ledger. He ran through the litany of specific details and events, which was composed mostly of inventory accounts and news of the captains and their progress. Coronado had a hard time listening and focusing. All the words became lost the second they were said, but Coronado acknowledged each statement Castaneda had uttered with a purposeful nod and a wave of his hand. And the more Coronado gazed off into the desert, the more perturbed he became. "Sir." "Yes, what is it?" "You have a letter from Captain Tovar, sir." "Sir." "Do you hear something, Castaneda?" Coronado said. "Hear what, sir?" said Castaneda. "A humming." "A humming?" "There's a humming in my head. It's very loud." "I'm sorry, sir, I can't hear it." "What does it say?" "Pardon, sir?" "Tovar's letter. What does it say?" "Tovar's men found some water. The scouts returned a couple hours ago. They found a stream along a hill." "And Sardina?" There's no report about Captain Sardina. I will inform you the second he arrives, though, sir." "But, sir." "Yes." "If I do say so, sir, you don't look well." "I'm not, Castaneda." Coronado pointed to the sky, bowed, turned about, and staggered off. He continued his rounds. He dragged and winced and cringed. He spotted a dozen of his men gathered about a fire. He approached them with a kind smile. Most of the men acted respectfully and quietly, but their faces remained flat and solemn as statues. Coronado acted in cordial democracy and asked each man what his level of faith was, and he demanded them to give their most honest answers. The men replied in earnest, though many of them lied through their teeth. The older men said that their faith in the expedition was still in high regard, although it had been somewhat diminished from the events of Cibola. The younger men, though, attested that their faith had never left them. As Coronado departed, a boy had followed him. His eyes were sad and gray. Coronado looked at the boy, and the boy looked up to Coronado. They stared at each other for 10 long seconds, and then the boy approached. "Sir," said the boy. "Governor." "Yes," said Coronado. "Please don't say it's over." "What are you talking about?" "The expedition." "The expedition?" "Yes. Please don't say it's over." "Why should you think anything's over?" "There's talk about the men. They said since we haven't found anything, it's likely we never will." "That's merely talk, son." "There has to be gold out here. There just has to be," said the boy. "There is," said Coronado. "I don't know about you, sir," said the boy, But what?" said Coronado. "We're going to find something. By God, we'll find something. I know it. I'll search through this desert until I die. The cities, they're further out. That's why we haven't found them yet." "You're right. You're absolutely right," said Coronado. "We have to keep searching. We just have to keep searching," said the boy. I know we'll find them. Keep to it, Coronado said. When the boy finished, Coronado patted him on the shoulder and gave the boy a look of conviction and certainty. Then Coronado departed. As he made his way over to the stable, Coronado mounted on his horse and peered back to the desert. He looked in each direction. He looked south, back to the mountains. Then he turned southwest, back to Mexico, back to Compostela. Then Cardenas broke his trance and tapped him on the shoulder. Forgive me, sir, said Cardenas, but I just can't get it off my mind. What? What is it? Marcos. Marcos? Yes. We should have killed him when we had the chance. That's in the past, Cardenas. You know we couldn't kill him. But look where he led us. He lied. Not just to the crown, but to all the men here. He lied. Killing him would have served no purpose, said Coronado. It would have brought morale, said Cardenas. Look at the men. Do you see how sad they look? They're beaten. If you would have killed Marcos, they would have loved you more than any man alive. I couldn't, Cardenas. What would the church say if I did? The church would have forgiven you. I highly doubt that. Marcos is still a reverend. Having his blood on my hands would only be further punishment. I don't see it like that. But before Cardenas could explain, Coronado snapped and pulled his reins. His horse neighed loud and hard. Enough of this talk. Go back to your men, Cardenas. A minute later, Coronado made his way inside his tent. He found his quill and the letters that he left unfinished. The first letter was to the viceroy. The other letter was for his wife Beatrice. He stared at the words of each letter, then he winced. He moved outside of his tent once more. In the corner of his eye, he spotted Brother Luis. He was teaching the newly baptized guides the story of Christ's return. Luis did not read to them. Instead, he talked with his hands and filled in the gaps with gestures of peace and harmony. When Luis finished, he dismissed the guides and bid them peace. And when they left, Coronado approached and sat on a pile of dry clay. Then Luis turned to Coronado. He noticed that his eyes were light and soft, and that his front teeth were missing. And Coronado, too, noticed that the brother's face looked extremely pained, frail, and old. It seemed as if Luis had aged 10 years. You teach them well, Luis, said Coronado. I teach them what I know, Governor. What I believe. What we believe. Is belief hard to teach? Yes, it's the hardest lesson to learn. Why is that? It just is, said Luis. We all have our doubts, some more than others. You seem pained, brother. Is there something wrong? I don't know if I can go on, sir. Not you, Luis. Why? I fear we're lost. Aren't you a shepherd, Luis? He did not respond. Coronado stared long and hard. You can't be lost, Luis. You've seen the cities, yes. You've seen them with your own eyes. Luis drew long and heavy breaths. He searched for the words. They came late and broken. I've seen them. Yes, of course I did, Governor. I've seen them. Then why worry? It's the men, Governor. What about them? Men can only take so much failure. Men need to see. Coronado looked out, but he did not gaze. We need you, Luis. Don't leave. You saw what Marcos saw, yes? You know what's out there. Yes, said Luis. In your heart, can you still see it? Yes, Governor. Then that's all that matters. Then Coronado let go Luis's hand. And rather than wait, Coronado got up to his feet and leaned his hands on Luis's shoulder. You're a better priest, Luis. You're a better man. We need you. Pray for me. Pray for Marcos. Then Coronado turned about and walked back to his tent. When he arrived, he sat and stared at his unfinished letters. And after a minute of discerning his writing, Coronado set both of the letters to a flame and started over. He grabbed his pen, dipped it into a vial of ink, then took a piece of parchment and penned the top of the page. Dearest Viceroy Mendoza. He stared at the page for a long minute. It took him several more minutes to write the first sentence. Then he reached for a bottle of wine and took a generous swig. He reached for another piece of parchment and headed the second letter. My beloved Beatrice. The page remained blank. He glared at both letters and tried his best to keep his eyes open. He took another swig. The parchment seemed elusive yet familiar, as if they had radiated from a spiritual realm that he alone could understand, as if his mind decoded them in a secret time long ago, as if they were already written, and it was his obligation to remember. But still, the pages remained blank, and they stared right back at him, as the ink smeared his hand. Another minute of silence elapsed, and as Coronado rested his head near the flame, he drooled and tried to move his pen. It took him quite some time, but finally, the words came. Dearest Viceroy Mendoza, Your Majesty will accept our humble and honest reply. It is with great hesitancy that I write this letter, for what I have to report is little less than terrible. It's been 5 months since our expedition left Compostela, and I regret to inform you that we still have not found the 7 cities, nor anything close to them or the presumed form. God knows that I wish I had better news to write to your lordship and his majesty. However, at the present time, I simply have not. I also regret to inform you that our trust in Fray Marcos and his claims have been severely compromised. Henceforth, the only thing we know for sure is that Fray Marcos has not told an ounce of truth, except to the names of the cities and the large stone houses that we had subdued exactly 1 month ago. The friar's claims have been invalidated, and it was agreed upon all persons involved that Fray Marcos be dismissed, and thus he departed from our company exactly 1 month ago. As I've said before, I never expected to find these cities in immediate fashion. No one in this entire expedition expected such a thing, but to this point, we have suffered and endured beyond what can be imagined, and our mission has been nothing other than misery, strife, and struggle. Yet, with all this horrendous misfortune, each man in this expedition continues to show great courage, and I'm very proud of them. They are truly exemplary Christians who possess a great, undying spirit. I know that the struggle we have endured these past 5 months has made us all stronger men, and our resolve is the only constant that keeps this expedition going. I myself shall not think of stopping until my death, and the same is true for every man. We will not yield to any invader or temptation. We will find the entirety of these illustrious cities, and I promise to find them very soon. Your humble friend and faithful servant, Francisco Vasquez de Coronado. From the Provost of Cibola in this city Granada, 3rd of August, 1540. As he finished the letter, Coronado sat upright, reached over to his side, and carefully placed a piece of parchment to his chest. Several minutes turned into an hour. He managed to write 1 word in all that time. He stopped almost every minute and lifted his head to gaze off into the distance. His quill dried out. He filled the nib, tapped it, and went at it again. He knew the words would come in their own time. He scratched at the page and slowly mouthed the word aloud. Beatrice. A half hour passed. He managed to write 1 complete sentence. It was an important one. It was perhaps the best sentence he had ever written, but he crossed it out and started over. Then a scout entered the tent and interrupted his concentration. Sir, said the scout, I have a letter, sir. Coronado glared, and the scout placed the letter on the ground, saluted, then departed. Soon after, Coronado left the tent and looked for a quiet place. He found a secluded area atop a pile of rubble, and he sat and wrote. The winds blew. The words poured. And Coronado stayed there until he reached the end of the page. When he finished, Coronado returned to his tent and rested to his side. Then he reached into his chest and retrieved the last thing Beatrice had given him, which was a lock of her hair. My beloved Beatrice, it's been a month since Cibola, yet all we have found was dust. Our hopes remain here bereft, yet we remain steadfast and hungry. In time we will find these cities. I know we will. I promise by the birth of our son we shall find them all, and the first city will be named St. Francis in his honor. There is hope, and I see it in all things. Yet sometimes I only see it in my dreams. I must tell you, dear, at the moment, I feel terrible. I feel as if I'm a failure. I see more shadows than I see real things. The only person I can tell all these things to is you. For the truth is the hardest thing to write, when your days are dictated by lies. But right now, lies are all we have at the moment. Lies and fabrications. Fabrications and unclear desires. What is it to suffer the fools of a dismaying fate? I truly love to know. I like to dance, but I have no legs. I like to sing, but I have no voice. I like to return, but I have no gold. And until I find it, my dear, I cannot bear to write another word. When we reached camp, I truly felt like Christ. For most of my life, I felt like the Christ of Golgotha, but not this time. This time, I felt like the Christ of Jerusalem, who entered into the city and was championed by cheers and palms. A crowd formed. We held the basket of gems for all to see. Eyes grew wide, then wider. There was confusion at first. They simply could not comprehend it. Then, when the right words were said, it awoke their demented souls. Their bodies shook. They stood electrified and stunned. And soon, a row of tired and sad faces suddenly became enraptured with euphoric joy. Gold? Where? No! How? Thank you, Jesus! Thank you, Lord! By noon, everyone in the camp knew of the Turks' gifts. They roared and whistled and jumped up and down. They laughed and broke out in snickers and yelps. I asked the men again and again if I were hallucinating, but every man said I wasn't. The men spoke about and could not contain their smiles. Then I found myself alone. And in a queer minute of thought, I realized what was before me. I was not in Jerusalem. I was not Christ. I was just an aging man who found a small handful of treasure. And indeed, it seemed as if all my life had amounted to that fact alone. I was still Sardina, the hard-luck, ill-fated bastard who left Spain to chase a dream. I approached the tent and found Coronado lying down on a pile of dirty wool with letters and pens scattered about and a half-dozen empty bottles of wine stacked upon each other. He appeared in a drunken daze, and he smelled as if he had died. Coronado stared at me and asked no questions, and I merely placed a handful of gold into his frail little hands. Then I showed him the basket and watched him examine each treasure. He held gold, he held silver, he held turquoise, and he held a small white pearl. And for about 5 minutes, all Coronado did was cry. The native has tales to tell, sir, I said to him. He will tell them in the evening. We placed the Turk in close quarters and protected him with 2 guards. At night, we gathered around the fire. The Turk was surrounded by half a dozen translators. He spoke in a language that was undefinable. It was a dialect that the interpreters could only follow every 3rd word of. And with each passing hour, a new tale was told. And the men listened and gawked, and warmed their aching bodies near the young, vibrant fire. I was tired and fell asleep early, but before I did, I heard the men whisper and cry, as they pondered and schemed upon their assumed fortunes. I walked back to my tent, drank a bottle of wine, and sat in silence. I whispered a prayer to God as I tried to close my eyes, and for one brief second, I felt a peace and content that I hadn't felt in a long time. I awoke refreshed, but it was still dark. My head no longer ached, and I could feel blood run through my hands as I did in my youth. I heard the men talk. The voices returned and swirled through the night in murmurs and snaps. More word had spread, more rumors and ecstasy. And soon, it felt as if I could hear the entire camp whisper and ponder. He obviously stole it. Yes, but from where and from whom? Marcos was right after all. Quivera. What did he say? Quivera! He said something about Quivera! What the hell is Quivera? I got to my feet and moved across to the main fire. I found the Turk still sitting there with a circle of our men gathered around him, and still he spoke in that beautiful fluid language of his, to which none of us understood a single word. As dawn broke, the Turk once again held the center of attention, and as promised, the Turk told his tales. He hadn't slept the entire night, and he kept at ease and rested his back along the edge of a stump. 20 new interpreters sat across from him. Again, the Turk told his tales of lands of gold. They were located east, some 200 miles away. He smiled with his eyes. He lured and broke through reason and common sense. And all throughout the telling, he never trembled. He kept entirely calm and still. Afterward, he pounded on his chest to confirm that all he said was true and infallible. The interpreter spoke in slow and daft fashion, while the priests relayed their own versions. By the end of the morning, the priest recited the men the third or fourth version. An hour later, Coronado appeared and sat beside the Turk. Coronado requested Brother Luis to be his main interpreter. Then Coronado bowed to the Turk and requested that the priest start from the very beginning. The priest asked the guides asked the Turk, and the Turk obliged and repeated. Coronado asked his question slowly. The first question was clear enough. Coronado said it in a long, drawn-out tone. Where are you from? The interpreters asked. Brother Luis asked again. The Turk just smiled. For quite some time, the Turk went on and described each city, the first and holiest of them being Quivera. He confirms they exist, said Luis. All 7 cities. The Turk went on. His words muddled. He shouted and repeated a phrase over and over. He says Cibola is the last city. He says Quivera is the first. He says it's a golden land that leads to a golden sea. The interpreters and Brother Luis remained perplexed. The Turk sat vexed and quietly shook his head. The men fixated on his eyes and were again mesmerized. And Coronado, too, fell into a deep trance. What is he saying, Brother Luis? Asked Coronado. Through a canyon? The cities? But then it does not... Not sure what he's saying, Governor. Wait. A land beyond emptiness. Quivera. Go on, Luis, said Coronado. Luis continued. But Quivera, like all great cities, heavily guarded. There are warriors who fight with golden spears and arrows, and they sleep with golden women. Brother Luis continued. A shaman from the north had a vision, the vision of a great warrior and his army conquering Quivera, and they are here, and the vision will now be fulfilled. What vision? Asked Coronado. The Turk muttered some more. The Holy Conquest, said Luis. The Turk spoke again. He looked at every Spanish eye and raised his hand. He says it has already been written, said Luis. The Turk spoke more. Luis relayed. He says he will be our guide. He says he will take us there." The Turk pointed to himself, and the Spanish smiled at his preposterous gesture. They leaned in closer. "Ask him to repeat." Brother Luis asked the guides. "Ask him where," said Coronado. "Where? Where? For God's sakes, ask him where!" This Turk, this devil of a man, became our salvation. He looked the part and assumed his role. His wretched face and scowl were of palpable disdain. But he was a bastard we believed in more. For at the time, he seemed much more. He seemed a strange deity, and he led with his eyes. They were powerful. They were all too alluring, too damning. Some had called the Turk another Marcos, another demented soul with no sense of common moral. All of the men had believed in him, but no man believed more than Coronado. For entire day and night, I saw the Turk by Coronado's side. Sometimes it looked like the Turk was Coronado's own personal valet. Other times it looked as if they were brothers of madness who understood all the realms of heaven, life, and hell. Whatever was the reason, there was a true and definite comfort the two had shared. Whatever was the reason, they had bonded immediately. As the interpreters gathered round, I saw Coronado's head bob up and down as he listened to the Turk babble on. It looked as if his head was floated in still water. He drooled and grinned like an infant. One time I saw the Turk smile and slap his knees, and I saw Coronado mimic and do the same. Clearly, it was a private joke they shared. They laughed and buckled and laughed again, shouting and howling like wolves in the night. And soon the Turk and Coronado began to sing a song. It was a drunken, incoherent song that held much meaning, and they sang it over and over again. And still, the Turk stood present at Coronado's side like a trusted advisor. It seemed as if they had shared a secret, some perverse, obscene secret. Perhaps the secret was the purpose of life for all we knew, though it might have been more. The next night, however, I saw Coronado alone. He was quite drunk. I found him talking to himself as he paced around the camp with a sword in his hand. He murmured and looked up to the stars. He grunted and sighed. Then he roared and screamed. Then I saw him lay on his back. "It's not far. It's not far at all." And it was only then that I knew just how lost we all were. In the morning, I was summoned to Coronado's tent and was met by Cardenas. He glared at me for a long time, not saying a word. He was trying to look right through me, trying to intimidate me, but I merely glared back at him and scowled just as hard. Then we both looked away. Coronado approached and talked with Cardenas. I eavesdropped on their conversation. They talked for about 5 minutes, and I looked west to the sunset. "This Turk knows," said Coronado. "Knows what, Governor?" Cardenas sighed. "Don't you see we're going in circles?" "That's your opinion, Cardenas." "No, it's not. It's a fact." "So you don't believe Cardenas?" "I don't believe in him." "What don't you believe?" "All we have is hearsay, sir. It's exactly like Marcos." Coronado took out the box of jewels and handed it over to Cardenas. "Is this hearsay, Cardenas?" "No, it's not. This is real. I can see it. You can feel it, can't you?" "I just don't want him to turn out like another Marcos. That's all." "I understand," said Coronado. "This treasure, wherever he found it, is certainly not enough for one man. But not 200, and certainly not enough for their families. I need more proof. Where is this land? Where are these goddamn cities? If the Turk can prove that, then I will retract everything I say. But until then, I don't trust him at all." Cardenas departed. I approached and saw Coronado deep in thought. Then Coronado looked back to the night's fires, and he gazed the familiar gaze. Cardenas is right about one thing, he said. Right about what? He's right that it's not enough. He picked up the box and picked out a ruby. Then he tossed it up in the air. It landed in my hands. This Turk has to prove himself some more. So the next day, we set forward again. We went west, upon a gathering of stone and sand. The air smelled like raw shit and rotted embers. And when I moved away from the horses, the unforgivable, horrible stank stayed with me and intensified. I stared at Coronado. Normally, I always sensed a tense and nervous anxiety from him that I attributed to his general personality. During midday, I heard them talk amongst each other. However, there was no translator present. It was the oddest exchange I had ever seen. Watched the two babble on with each other. For a minute, I thought of the two as long-lost lovers, most likely in a past life, but they were now living in the absurd times of the present. They seemed to be lovers in a quarrel, to be lovers beyond reason and rational thought, but nevertheless, they found each other, and held each other in a strong and passionate embrace, and had left the rest of the world behind. It was a romantic thought, but I entertained the thought for many days on end. Given how much wine I consumed the prior night and the previous morning, and given how horrible the heat had got, I was used to my mind conceiving incredible and ludicrous ideas, and this one was no exception. At noon, we trekked the stark, hot sands. We walked for 2 miles. The men shared their doubts. Some hollered. Others merely spat and shook their heads. We've gone enough west. Don't you think, Captain? Said Julio. I believe so, I said. Then I heard Coronado yell. He was drunk. He spat and slurred his words. Show us your treasure, great Turk. Show us hence. As we went down another mile, the Turk pointed to a large set of stone paths. The guides confirmed. Below was a pass that led to a rock quarry. It had been hidden beneath a nettle of moss and cacti. We slashed through and found an opening to a cave. We all studied the cave. It was inexplicable. It seemed we had passed by it before. I ordered Julio to go in first. A minute passed. We waited and said a private prayer, and Coronado pointed onward. I ordered my men to search through the pass, and they all went inside. Cardenas and Tovar's men soon followed, and their smiles were as grand and wide as the day they left Compostela. I turned to the Turk. He laughed and snarled. He snorted and smirked. And then it happened. It was Julio, and in his hand rested a golden cross. All gathered and cried. It looked exactly like the cross Marcos had carried back to Galicia. It was about 2 feet in length. It was shiny and smooth, and it glistened. But most of all, it represented the reason. The only reason we trekked so far. So the Turk led the Spanish on. They traveled due east for 3 days. A day later, the Turk guided the Spanish 5 miles north. He led with a stern face, and he promised there was more to find beyond the valley. Ahead, they came upon a small village that was sparse and disorderly. These were prairie people. They grew squash, beans, and corn, and much like the desert farmers in the valley, they prayed every day to an empty sky. Their crops, though plentiful, were yellow, then scathed and depleted by the heat. They watched them plant new crops by hand and foot, and noticed that each of the villagers' faces were covered in sweat and dust. They breathed through their mouths and worked ceaselessly on the hard, dry earth. According to the translators, it had not rained there for an entire month. Nevertheless, the Turk spoke with the village chief. As the day passed, the Turk did not speak to the villagers. Rather, he worked with them. He took seeds of corn and beans and joined the villagers, helping them plant their autumn harvest. The Turk fell into rhythm, as did each villager. They dropped each seed to the ground with one foot and compressed the soil with the other. As dusk approached, the villagers finished their seedings and prepared the evening meal. The Turk, though, remained by the crops. He started to babble. Later, he yelled and shouted to the sky. Then the Turk danced. The Spanish kept their distance and watched a swirl of dust and sand blow from out yonder west. They asked their translators what the Turk was up to. The translators, in turn, asked the villagers. "He's at prayer," they said. "What is he praying for?" The Turk continued to dance. The villagers soon joined him. Loud booming drums filled the air, and as they gyrated their hands, the sky turned gray and black. But the drummers kept in time. They kept balance and carried in tune. And as the sky grew darker, finally, all heard a pool of rumbling thunder. They danced faster and faster, and the Turk directed the chorus. The thunder grew louder, and the wind swept at a torrid pace. And then finally, a single mist had fallen to the parched dead earth. And when it landed, the villagers screamed and cried. Their prayers had finally been answered. They danced and screamed in the fallen mist, and they shouted louder as the mist grew to a harder drizzle. Then the rain finally fell. And then it poured. It poured and flashed and flooded. Then it slipped and tumbled and formed black mud. It poured for an hour in steady, cleansing, healthy streams. But the villagers did not take shelter. Instead, they stood in the rain and let it soak their tired and ravaged bodies. And they looked to their now saved crops as a sign that their God still loved them. When the rain finally ended, the Turk embraced each villager, and out in the distance, the Spanish simply stared, not knowing what to say.